Thank you so much for that kind introduction. This is a wonderful, glorious bookstore. It's great to be here. It's so airy. There's so many books. So the idea that any of you would actually buy mine when there's so many others is very flattering to me. Thank you all for coming on this beautiful Monday night. What I wanted to do is talk a bit about my aspirations for the book for a few minutes, and then I wanted to, rather than read from the book, I wanted to talk about a few kind of eureka moments for me in the researching of the book, when either I came across some documents, some material, some unreleased recordings, or interviewed somebody, and the story of Richard Pryor's life kind of cracked open for me, and I realized I had to tell it in a different way than had been told before, that people kind of received his life, or presumed his life to be. So a few things about the aspirations behind the book. I thought I'd riff for a second about the cover. I guess authors often don't talk about their covers, but in my case, I really love my cover. I worked it out a bit collaboratively with the book designer. And if you look at the cover, one thing that I really love about it is that cover of a book is a two-dimensional thing. It's a flat object. But this is a cover that punches out into three dimensions. You have Richard Pryor framed by his name, the title of my book as well, and yet he's kind of punching out of the frame and achieving the kind of three-dimensionality that you wouldn't expect. And I think that was, in some sense, my aspiration behind the book for a number of reasons. I felt like he brought a new multi-dimensionality to comedy on stage, and I wanted to reveal that. And if you look at this image, the picture we get of him, you get a sense of how he introduced a new complexity of tonality into comedy. What kind of expression is this? On the one hand, he's looking at you. There's a kind of aggression there, in the sense that he's challenging you or confronting you. On the other hand, there's a kind of vulnerability there, a certain kind of fear that plays out on his face. It's not the fear that you saw in earlier comedians, was like, feats don't fail me now, or, oh, there's ghosts everywhere. It's, the kind of the way that earlier black actors have been forced to be comics in Hollywood. It's kind of, you can't tell, is it real or is it a contrivance? It's something in between, and Pryor often played on that line. And one thing I loved about this image is that I've been at the bookstore near where I live in Berkeley is called Mrs. Dalloway's. And maybe because I live half a block away, they got a big poster of the book. And so this face was blown up huge on College Avenue in Berkeley. And I felt like whenever people walked by, Richard Pryor's eyes were kind of following them. And they had to think, what would he think about them? I appreciated that. So there's a kind of three-dimensionality to the kind of complexity of his comedy. But we have to think about how difficult it was for him to achieve that. He grew up, and as I might explain in more detail later on, he grew up in the red light district of Peoria, Illinois in the 40s. And he loved, from a very early age, going to movie theaters. He loved the comedians he saw on TV. But the comedians he saw in that way, it was Red Skelton, it was Jerry Lewis, it was Sid Caesar. They were wonderful comedians. They specialized in a kind of antic and zany comedy, but they didn't specialize in the kind of satirical, cutting, and tender comedy that he created. So he had to reinvent the rules for comedy if he was going to make it multidimensional. And then there was the added challenge, which is the fact that he was black. And when he was growing up in Peoria, Illinois, he went and he loved these movies, but the black actors in those movies were always in the supporting roles, never the star. It was Willie Best, and that was the person who was playing the porter, the night watchman. So always the supporting role, never the star, always supporting the white actors. And yet he really broke through as a new kind of black comic actor who would be the star. And that's a really incredible achievement. I felt like earlier biographies, although I'm indebted to them, they hadn't really captured his emotional complexity and the complexity of his story. The people who had written them weren't historians, and so they didn't exactly know where to look to be able to reconstruct the milieus that he was part of that shaped him, and then how he kind of reshaped the culture in return. So anyway, I want to talk a bit about a few eureka moments, how I tried to capture that complexity. In some ways I feel like Richard Pryor was so endlessly complex that as deep as you are, that's how deep he'll go. And I don't know if I got as deep as he is. In fact, I doubt. I know I didn't. But I sure it was an incredibly fulfilling and deep experience for me to try to plumb those depths and reconstruct where he came from. So a few stories now about the researching this book. I'll begin with the puzzle of how did Richard Pryor change when he came to the Bay Area? The reason this was a puzzle was because in earlier accounts of Richard Pryor's life, there was a sense that he came to Berkeley sometime, was it 1969, was it the early 70s? Well, earlier biographers couldn't nail it down, but that he had come to Berkeley and he had been kind of a Cosby-esque comic in the mid-60s. And somehow when he left Berkeley and he started doing work in 72, 73, he would no longer be mistaken for Bill Cosby. He's more like the Richard Pryor we know. And so the question is, the Berkeley episode seems like this hinge moment, but what exactly happened? And we only had sort of hazy accounts of it. So that's one of the first puzzles I tried to solve as a biographer. It's like, well, what really concretely happened? One of the few hard facts I knew about his time in Berkeley is that he had DJ'd a little for KPFA, the Pacifica station. And so, like any historian, I said, well, you gotta go to the Pacifica Archive. So I went to the Pacifica Archive in North Hollywood, and I started going through all the newsletters. I was like, when is Richard Pryor's name gonna pop up? Because that will give me a sense of when he actually was in Berkeley. So this is kind of, one of the things you have to be as a biographer is a drudge. I embrace the drudgery. You find such amazing things. So 68, no Richard Pryor. 69, no Richard Pryor. 1970, the first mention of Richard Pryor by a guy named Alan Farley, but only because Alan Farley is watching him on TV. 1971, suddenly Richard Pryor appears again and again, always in connection with Alan Farley, who was operations manager at KPFA. And then at some point, Alan Farley gives some of his show over to Richard Pryor, and then Richard Pryor gets his own show on KPFA in the fall of 1971. So this is a nice lead. I was like, well, who's Alan Farley? Well, did anybody here listen to Alan Farley? Okay, remember him. Alan unfortunately passed away a few years ago from liver cancer. But when I started this book in 2007, he was still a figure in Bay Area public radio. He had gone from being operations manager at KPFA, then he was head announcer at KLW in San Francisco. So I met with him, and I was like, well, you talked a lot about Richard Pryor. I was like, well, actually, I was his roommate. I was the person who drove him up from Los Angeles to Berkeley after the big earthquake in February of 71. And we lived together, and then he explained that he had basically served later as his road manager and so on. And we had a nice interview about his time with Richard. But the most fascinating thing he said was that, well, I have these tapes. Tapes. It's like, well, he was a gearhead, being an operations manager of a radio station. So he had this really incredible sense, a very perspicacious person, that Richard Pryor was important. Now in 1971, I don't think many people in the world thought that Richard Pryor was going to be a world-changing artist. But Alan fortunately did, and so whatever Richard Pryor, whenever he went, Alan would tape him. And at some point, because Richard Pryor was interested in exploring his creativity in new ways, Alan would give him his tape recorder, and Richard would just do these experiments. It was Berkeley, it's 1971. You have basically every social movement in existence in America is putting down roots in Berkeley. Prisoners' rights movement, women's liberation, the Black Power movement, anti-war movement. It's all happening in the epicenter that is Berkeley. And Richard Pryor is very energized by this. Anyway, so Alan said, if you want to, why don't you listen to these tapes? It's like, great. So I went to KLW and I listened to these tapes. I spent a day listening to them, and it was quite revelatory. Very little on these tapes would be thought to be commercial, because Richard Pryor really wasn't trying to be funny. And that was a fascinating discovery for me as his biographer. he came to Berkeley and he was liberated from the need to make people laugh. And in feeling that free, he could just explore different mediums and try to find who he was through punching through to new places. So, for example, there was a sound collage he made in response to the clamp down on the Attica prison riot. There was an anti-Vietnam War screenplay where he performed all the different characters. There was the radio shows that he did. There was stand-up performances he did, but they were highly political, and they expressed more disenchantment than any desire to make people laugh. And this was I came out of that. My head was there was also like scenarios for guerrilla films that could never be made because they were either unfilmable or so pornographic that it's like, what? And not even the craziest midnight movie theater is going to screen that. All these different experiments, and it really solidified or crystallized my sense that Richard Pryor and other people had thought, earlier biographers had talked about him as having this overpowering need for success. One person who reviewed my book actually said, and I would never agree with this, that he was extremely greedy. That it was like, he just wanted the money. But at the center of my book is really the sense that what Richard Pryor was searching for was himself. And since he was an artist, his art was the crucial medium by which he was going to find himself. And there were very few ways for him to find, very few places where he could express himself, given where he had come from, given that he grew up in the red light district, given that he was black, and so on, all these experiences he had had. And there's a quote I later discovered, which I think captures very much the kind of searching qualities of his exile time in Berkeley. This is from 1967. It's actually the first interview where he admits to an interviewer. It's an interviewer from Ebony magazine, who had a largely black middle-class audience. It was the first interview in which he said that he was raised in a brothel. The first time he ever said that, the interviewer laughed. She thought he had to be joking, and that's how she reported it. It gives you a sense of just how people were like, they can't they can't digest the truth of his life for a long time. Anyway, in that interview, he was asked if he thought he was going to make it. He said, "I never thought about not making it, but the it has nothing to do with show business. The it I'm making is me. Who am I?" And I think it's just so beautiful that he ends with the question, who am I? And that is really a search that galvanizes his life and galvanizes the pages of my book. So that was the first discovery, the Berkeley years. And I think the portrait of Pryor you get in my book is of a somewhat experimental artist. Not just a comedian, but somebody who changes and shifts off its axis pretty much any creative project he's part of, because he fundamentally doesn't respect rules and genre conventions, but needs to put in his own perspective, his own creativity. A second eureka moment involved my researching around the family. When I feel like when I started the book, the family is very important to the story of Richard Pryor. He grew up, the woman he called Mama was his grandmother, and he's done a lot of really wonderful stand-up routines that are about his grandmother, who's this fearsome presence. She was the she was the madam in the brothel in which he was raised. And she walloped him into wisdom whenever he strayed from the path of righteousness. Mm-hmm. And he has some incredible stand-up routines about the violence that she meted out and how he reacted to that. But I wanted to understand Marie Pryor, his woman he called Mama, not through the eyes of the grandson. That's what the stand-up conveys. But through the eyes of a historian. Who was this woman? Where did she come from? Well, it turned out she was born in Decatur, Illinois. It's a little 100 miles or so from Peoria. And in fact, that her family was in the papers a lot because they lived and they operated in kind of the underworld of Decatur. They were involved in pretty much every illegal business that Decatur, Illinois had to offer, whether it was bootlegging, prostitution, gambling, opium trade, so on. But that's actually not the story that opened my eyes to who Marie Pryor was. I was looking at these old microfilms, and I came across this article from October 20th, 1929, in the Decatur Herald. It was called "Boy Slapped, Woman Routs Proprietor of Confectionery." And the story of this article was about how Richard Pryor's grandmother had heard about a black boy being slapped at this confectionery that it turned out was about half a block from where she lived. And given the age of Richard Pryor's father at the time, I think it was his father who was the black boy who was slapped. So Marie Pryor went into that confectionery, which was run by a Greek-American couple, and there was a Greek-American woman behind the counter, and she came in there with a cudgel for the purpose of evening the score. And she started wailing on the woman behind the counter who had slapped the black boy. And she kept wailing until she opened up a flesh wound. The woman ran out, and Marie Pryor just stayed there. She held her ground and just waited for the police to arrive. This is a black woman, 29 years old, coming from a poor family, but she is holding her ground because she's kind of possessed by her own righteousness. And so the Decatur police, an all-white police force, as you would imagine at the time, and you think about places like Ferguson, it's not that far from what Decatur's like. Obviously back then, Decatur probably worse. The police act as if a bank has been robbed. They summon 5 cops to subdue one 29-year-old black woman, and she just stands there, holds her ground, and is charged with assault. But the story doesn't even end there, because Marie Pryor, after she's charged with assault, she fires back a countercharge. She's going to not just use her physical force to hold her ground and to stand up for the rights of this black boy, but she's going to actually use the legal courts. And so she files a countercharge. She said, I wasn't the one who was guilty of assault. It was the Greek-American couple. They're the one, in effect, who started it. Now, as it happens, this plays out in the courts, and Marie has to pay the fine, not the Greek-American couple. But I think it gives you a sense of what kind of woman this was who raised Richard Pryor. She was a woman who through her own intelligence, through her own cunning, and through her own physical strength, made a way out of no way. And if we want to think about how Richard Pryor became such a kind of world-altering performer, where did that strength come from to disrespect the rules of comedy or Hollywood, what have you, to find a greater creativity? Part of it, a lot of it comes from the strength that his grandmother infused into him. And she also gave him an understanding of human complexity, because she was rooted in the underworld, but she was not fully part of the underworld. She was not consumed by the underworld. So, yes, Marie Pryor ran the brothel. And on Saturday nights in the brothel in Peoria, when Richard Pryor's growing up, he's hearing screams. He doesn't know where the screams are coming from. And it's always Marie who comes in with the straight razor or the gun to settle things, to make sure the business operates smoothly. But after the revels of Saturday night, Sunday morning, Richard Pryor is woken up by his grandmother. They go to Morning Star Baptist Church, and there they rock and sway with the congregation and feel the Spirit. That's the kind of complexity Richard Pryor grew up with. It's also the kind of complexity where you see a priest come into the brothel and he's wearing the collar, he takes it off so that he can go upstairs. Where you see politicians coming in to a brothel and having an understanding with the brothel owners, because that was the kind of place that Peoria was. Nowadays, people think of Peoria as kind of a synonym, stand-in for Middle America cleanness. But in the 40s, when Richard Pryor was growing up, it was the most loose Sin City in the Midwest. Al Capone's crew visited Peoria in the 30s, and they're like, we've never seen anything like this. I mean, I thought Chicago, where we could, I thought that was pretty amazing, but like, it's open gambling, open corruption, open prostitution with no interference in the law. That's the world Richard Pryor grows up in. And as I say, it was a morally complex world that's what he grew up with, and that's one thing he presented in his art. And it comes from, in some ways, his grandmother, who's both, she runs the brothel. She also opens up a tavern where they have jazz. She also opens up a beauty shop. She's an entrepreneur of the underground and of the above ground, the legitimate business. And that kind of complexity is what he's wanting to bring on stage. I'm going to tell one more story, and then I'd love to hear where you're coming from with your Q&A. This is a story about I talked to several people who were involved in relationships with Richard Pryor as an adult, companions of his. And this person, her name was Patricia Heitman. She actually met Richard Pryor in Sausalito, in Marin, and she was living near that houseboat community in the 70s, where a lot of people from the counterculture took refuge, although she really wasn't of that world. She told me that Richard came out to Sausalito because that's where the person who sold him cocaine lived. Anyway, I met Patricia, and I really feel so grateful that she spoke to me, because she hadn't talked at length to any other biographer. And she basically was with Richard from 1971, when he was in the Bay Area, through 1975, say, when he's having these big breakout roles and things like the Saturday Night Live episode he hosts and things like that. And we met at Yamashiro, which is a Japanese restaurant in the hills of Hollywood. And it has these beautiful gardens that Richard Pryor loved. He actually loved Japanese culture. He would walk around in a kimono and clogs. Again, a very complicated person. Most people don't think about that serenity he aspired to, but he would walk around gardens, kimono and clogs. But he was also an incredibly difficult person, and the closer you got to him, if you were a woman, often the more violent sides of him he would be exposed. And so Patricia told me this one story, which I'll relate to you, where Richard asked her to go out and do something that I think no woman should be asked to do for a partner. And she tried to do it, but she couldn't. And she came back, and he flew into a rage because she hadn't done it. And he had these bottles of Courvoisier, empty bottles. He started beating her with them. And he seemed to be, outside of himself in his rage. At one point, she hid behind a door, and then closed the door, and he took out a hatchet that he had been used for chopping up firewood, and he started hatching the door. It was almost like from The Shining or something. And he broke through, and then when he got to her, he started choking her. And he had this faraway look in his eyes, and he kept choking and choking. And then he felt sick with himself, and he threw up on the floor and collapsed. And then he said, "Help me, Mama. Help me, please." And let's say a few things about this episode as I interpret it as a biographer. First of all, you see that the way he lived his life was in tune with his comedy, the way that his comedy could be both very intensely violent and very tender. And here he's flipping between almost being capable of homicide, perhaps, and being completely helpless like a baby. And that's what you get in his comedy, that range of who he could be, who people could become. The second thing I would say is that, when I spoke with Patricia, after that happened, she left him for a while, she came back. But she loved Richard Pryor, and she still loves him as an artist, and she maintained a friendship with him. And I felt like if I was to write this Richard Pryor story in a way that was true to his life and true to the world that was around him, true to the relationships he had, I had to deal with the fact that love, as experienced by people around Richard Pryor, was marbled with so many other kinds of emotions. It wasn't pure romantic love like we get in our rom-coms that we love, like we get in a Disney movie, but it was more like love in the spirit of the blues. Love that involves brutal turns of fate, twists of fate, brutal tricks of fortune, and just a harsh sense of almost being possessed by devils and demons. That was kind of the emotional spectrum that Richard Pryor lived in. And when I went to, with Patricia, we took a tour of the old cottage where they had lived, where he'd used that hatchet. And it was a landlord who wasn't he didn't spend that much money on the repairs. And so you could actually see the door was still there, and it still had, instead of being completely fixed, there was just a little plywood that was put up there. And you could still see the kind of scar from that night. It was still there. So and I'll just end there. Richard Pryor was an incredible, as I said, world-changing artist. On the other hand, I feel like to write a biography, to write a true biography, you have to take in the all of the person. And that's what I tried to do. I tried to pay as great tribute to his art as I thought was right, to show how much he changed in Hollywood and on the standard stage, but also to understand the full complexity of the world that made him who he was and the person that he was when I was following him. So thank you so much, and look forward to your questions. Yes?
Well, I have a few things that I'm curious about. I did some stand-up in the 70s and 80s, and he was a big influence on me. But what I loved was his 2 albums prior to Live on Sunset Strip, I believe, if my chronology is right. Is It Something I Said, where he's being burned at the stake on the cover, and That Nigger's Crazy, which I thought were much funnier than Live on Sunset Strip, and also a lot of work that he did after that. But I think Live on Sunset Strip became the big thing, and then of course he went into movies. So I just wanted your comment on those 2 albums. That's when he was still using the N-word, and it was coarser and a lot of differences between black and white and all that. And also remind me how it all ended. He had MS, and was it a long, torturous path at the end, or how did his death come about?
So in 1985, he was diagnosed with MS. And after that point, he did some Hollywood movies, but he basically slipped more and more into the shadows. He became more and more solitary. And the disease in the end ravaged him and made it hard for him to control himself physically. And this was one of the things that I'd say in my book is that the first thing he was as a comedian was a physical comedian. Looking at Jerry Lewis and Sid Caesar performing for his classmates who were all white in 1954, he was 7th and 8th grade. That's what he is. And I feel like that's at the core of his power a lot, is how he makes emotions instantly visible, the grace of his body and so on, voices. And he lost that. And then he kind of retreated, partly as a result. So that's so by the time he died in 2005, I think people were like, well, we haven't seen him. Where was Richard? It had been maybe 15 years since he was really around.
And his last wife was a white woman. Did she stay with him till the end?
So Jennifer is his executor. So his last wife, she was also involved in his life from 77 to 81. And she was married to him then. And that brings up an interesting issue, which is that, I talked about showing the all of Richard Pryor, the brutality as well as the tenderness. And, Jennifer Pryor wrote a memoir called Tarnished Angel after she broke up with him in 81, and in which she tells so many horrible stories about how tortured their relationship was. Richard Pryor was the kind of person who said, he read it, he was like, he said, that bitch got it right. And then he went and he remarried her. This was somebody who appreciated people telling the truth. He hated euphemisms. He was so allergic to all the ways we dance around the truth of who we are and all our complexity and all our ugliness as well as all our beauty. So I just wanted to put that in there. In terms of what you said about the stand-up albums, I personally, my book goes to 79. It's 600 pages, and I felt like better to have a really fast-moving 600-page book that takes them up to live in concert, really. There's an epilogue that deals with the rest of the life, but I felt like that's the moment at which I feel his talent achieves its full genius. And I want to show that arc. I think he does wonderful things after that, but they're predicted by what he's done already. And to my mind, yes, those albums and That Nigger's Crazy.
Before Sunset Strip?
That's before, yes. That Nigger's Crazy, 74. Is It Something I Said, 75. Bicentennial Nigger, 76. This is an incredible run of album, one after the other, that, as I say, reinvent what's possible from the stand-up stage. So I do pay attention to those, where they came from.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes, Matt.
I think it must have been her, was she married to him when he died, Jennifer?
Jennifer, yes.
Yeah, she was talking about Bill Cosby and saying that Bill didn't like Richard because Richard was so dirty and down and out, whatever, just grimy, and his comedy. And, but Jennifer was saying, and so Bill only talked about really clean stuff, whatever. And here he was a rapist, and Richard was just a kind of a regular guy. Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't call him regular guy, although I think it would be said that, in the 80s, Richard Pryor did become more mindful and stopped being violent toward the women he was with, so he changed.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, this is one of the great, incredible ironies, is now we think of, Richard Pryor as more of a moral model than Bill Cosby, who always put himself up
Yeah.
as America's father, America's dad, the Huxtable, but
I want to interject this. That whole time before any of that came out, when I used to watch that show he had with the family, what was it
the
called?
Cosby Show.
Yeah. But I always used to think his face, like something's wrong with that guy. His face isn't right. He looks evil. And I was right.
Well, that may be true. I would say, I feel ambivalent about the whole Bill Cosby issue, because I feel like, he was a great comedian in terms of the strategy he pursued. And Seinfeld talks about it. It's just such an incredible storyteller. He showed how it was possible to develop a new kind of storytelling-based humor, and a lot of different comedians have taken him up. He gave them resources, gave them vocabulary in some sense, techniques. That's separate from him as a person, and I think that these, what's come out is hideous, but the interesting thing to me is that Bill Cosby, his strategy was, in his comedy, to present a kind of idealized image of who he was, right? And so eventually he becomes America's dad, through the Cosby Show. Richard Pryor was always a different strategy, which is, I'm going to expose all of who I am and force people to engage with that, and just as I'm going to expose everything that I see out there. Call things by their proper names, even if those come in 4-letter packages. And we're going to talk about our society as it truly is, as opposed to project an idealized version for the sake of people having role models in their comedy.
That girl that he married, Jennifer, must have been just like him. Because when she talked about Bill Cosby, the interviewer said, well, what do you think of him now? And she's like, he's a piece of shit.
Yeah, she doesn't believe in euphemisms. I think that's maybe one reason why he made her the executor of his estate, in the sense, like, this is a person who's very tough.
Yeah.
And she, is going to make things happen and act as she sees fit. She's not going to dance around things. Yes.
I kind of have a memory of him not only having jokes but telling stories and ending in a joke. Was that something that Richard Pryor, sorry, I'm off Cosby.
Yeah, that's fine. Good.
That's not really connected to
No.
Pryor. But his style, did he have writers for that? Did he come up with his own stories? How did he get to some of these spots that he ended up?
Richard Pryor was just so inventive. That's one of the things that I tried to develop. Is like there were so many different resources that he had.
Okay.
So like, for example, through the character of Mudbone, this was a great vehicle for him to just unleash these stories. And in fact, my sense as biographer is that he created all those stories.
Okay.
Some of them were rooted in kind of folk tales, conjure tales about, the voodoo ladies and stuff like that. But he was always giving everything his own inflection. He did have a right-hand man who was Paul Mooney.
Right.
And Paul Mooney has talked about how Paul Mooney loved punchlines. He liked quick jokes, And he did supply a few punchline-like jokes to Richard. But Richard kind of moved away from punchlines. One of the things that I talk about is, he came into comedy as a professional when he moved to Greenwich Village in 1963, Richard Pryor did. And he was coming into Greenwich Village at the moment that the Improv was founded as a place. Now, the Improv is founded, it's mostly for Broadway stars to kind of hang out and sing, but it gets taken over by the comics. And the comics take it over and start experimenting with collective improv exercises. And so that's kind of one of the early ways that Richard Pryor becomes a professional, is going up on stage, 12 o'clock, 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and just playing with scenarios, playing with character. And I think that's a lot of his humor comes from throwing himself into character. In some sense, escaping his character, escaping who he was. That's the 60s.
Okay.
By the 70s, he starts to say, actually, I'm going to start talking about who I am more on stage. So the stories often come from, exploring character or exploring the stories of his life.
I remember him on, I think it was Johnny Carson's show, I'm not sure, but he was sitting there with, and one of the guys was smoking a cigar. Do you know that story at all?
I don't know.
Okay, one of the guys was smoking a cigar, and I guess Richard didn't like the smell of the cigar. So as this guy's talking to Johnny, Richard puts water in the ashtray. So this guy puts his, he flicks the ashtray and puts his cigar in the ashtray. Next thing you know, it's not lit.
Yeah.
And of course, he has an attitude about the whole thing because he was being one up by that incident. So
He was good at reading people's auras and instantly cutting to the quick. So this person maybe had this thing with the smoke, the cigar.
Exactly.
There's a famous story about Evel Knievel. He was on a talk show with Evel Knievel, the great daredevil. And Evel Knievel came on stage and he had this very beautiful cane, gold, And so Evel Knievel's being interviewed and talking about all the crazy things he's going to do. And then Richard Pryor said, so something happens to you, what happens to the cane? To just sort of shift his thinking, shift the frame. And mention the unmentionable. There's more to say there.
So you said your book ends in 70?
So my book basically ends with the creation of Live in Concert.
Okay.
And also that he creates Live in Concert, his first stand-up concert movie, which pretty much invents the genre of the concert movie. He creates it at the same time his grandmother, Marie, dies. And Marie is basically, my first chapter is just about Marie and where she came from. And she was his rock. She was a very jagged rock, but she was his rock. And after she dies, he kind of loses his moorings. And he spins and he spins, and he ends up in this intense depression. And it's out of that depression that he sets himself on fire. And he's a changed person, physically, psychologically, after that fire. So I see his life really splits in two. And so I kind of take him up to Live in Concert. And in an epilogue, I give people a sense of the full life, but I don't treat it in the kind of granular, novelistic detail.
You said set himself on fire. I thought he was smoking crack and caught on fire. I mean, is there?
No, it was a kind of I describe it as an act of improvisation that unfortunately seared away the urge to improvise. And what I mean by that is that he was in this very deep hole of crack use.
Okay.
He was not lucid. He was having something of you could call, I'm not a doctor, but it seems like it could be called some kind of psychotic episode or break. He had seen on TV an image of a monk dousing himself and setting himself on fire, protest against the Vietnam War and how religious minorities were treated in South Vietnam. And then he started having this dialogue with God. God, why are you doing this to me? I'll show you, God. And he poured this overproof rum over his head, and he lit himself on fire. And then the moment he lit himself on fire, he did not want to tinker with God, and he wanted to be alive. But he was not exactly lucid, and so when people came with blankets to try to smother the flames, he was like, "You're trying to kill me!" And he ran out of the house. and his like polyester shirt melted onto him, and he just kept running. I mean, this is kind of, it's a very powerful, story. He's just running, jogging, and then walking. And he's saying things like, "Lord, didn't I do anything in this world to give people happiness?" And the police come, and he's like, "I don't want you to take me." And finally, like a half mile from his house, the people in the ambulance finally convince him to stop, and then they take him to the burn center. And he when he was asked after that episode, he was asked, "Well, where were you born?" And he said, "I was born at the Sherman Oaks Burn Center," because he felt like he had changed so much after that experience. So that's one reason why I kind of take him, up to 79. I really feel that he's a different person after that.
Did he ever actually say that as definitively as you are, that he doused himself with the rum and lit himself? Because I thought in the movie that he made it seem like an accident, or he was vague about it.
Yeah, he kind of skirted the issue in Light of the Sunset Strip. And in fact, he did not like Light of the Sunset Strip when he was making it. And I think it's a great movie in many ways. But I think, again, like, he was allergic to euphemisms, and he didn't like his own moral evasiveness in that movie. And so when he made the biopic of himself, JoJo Dancer, Life's Gone, he set the record straight a bit more. My account kind of pieces together more other bits of testimony, kind of reports on stuff,
I guess Jim Brown became one of his rock at a later stage in his life, but that wouldn't be in your book because that relationship started later, probably after the fire, I guess.
Yeah,
or the
that's
burning.
not in my book,
the
but
burn.
yeah, that's and then he had trouble staying close to Jim Brown.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because they Richard Pryor got this great opportunity in the mid '80s to have his own production company, Indigo, and Jim Brown was going to be part of it, and they had creative differences about how to run the business, and Jim Brown was ousted. It was very difficult.
Two strong personalities.
Could be, or it could just be. I think Richard Pryor was an amazingly talented person. Was he the person to run a film company? I don't think he really had. There was no part of him that had the soul of a bureaucrat or businessman. So I don't know. I think it would have been hard. It would be hard to run a company with Richard Pryor's head.
Wasn't the story that Jim Brown showed up and just said, "What are you going to do?
What you gonna do?"
What you going to do?"
Right.
And also, did he stay friends with Paul Mooney throughout? Was Paul with him, stuck with him as a friend? Because I know they were sort of partners, and Mooney helped him write some of this stuff, as you mentioned. I'm just wondering if Paul stuck with him.
I would say that he was one of the closest things to what you would call a lifelong friend that Richard Pryor had. There was the way he became very reclusive in the later years. So I don't know how close they were, just because he really was seeing very few people. Even his children, he would see once a month or something like that, maybe a little more. But he didn't have that many visitors. Yes.
I remember hearing him live on KPFA a few times. The afternoon show was his show. He wasn't a guest. And when he was living here, he was already pretty famous. I thought, how cool that such a unique social observer have time with KPFA to talk. Do you know if any of those tapes still exist?
Yeah, I mean, I've listened to them. They definitely exist, and KPFA, I think, has been trying to replay them because they're always looking to make money on their fundraising drives. Please support KP Pacifica.
I have never heard him repeat them.
Yeah, I think you look them up online, you might be able to find them. But I think the thing to remember in '71 is that Richard Pryor, he had been something of a successful crossover star. He was on Ed Sullivan, he was on Merv Griffin, he was on The Partridge Family, guest episode, Mod Squad, guest star, stuff like that. But he had kind of dropped out, and he was persona non grata in a lot of clubs across the country because he refused to censor himself. And so a big club like Mr. Kelly's in Chicago, which was one of the big clubs in between Vegas and New York, Mr. Kelly's. It's New Year's Eve 1970, he basically says, the person running Mr. Kelly says, "Hey, you've got to stay within these limits." And Richard Pryor says, no way, I don't do that anymore. And so by the middle of his time in Berkeley, in 1971, he says in an interview that there's only 4 places left in America where he feels he can perform. And 2 of them are in the Bay Area. One of them is in LA, in kind of the Crenshaw district, black area of LA. And one of them is the Cellar Door in DC. And that's it. And he feels like every place else is closed off to him.
That was nice about, what he was doing on KPFA, because it wasn't really doing any shtick or anything, he was, just talking.
Yeah, he was breaking down the events of the day, not being more of a political commentator in some ways. Yeah. That's
What's
crazy.
the
You
other-
heard them. You're the first person I've met who actually heard them.
Oh, yeah? Like late afternoon on, I don't know, Friday or Saturday.
When was he at the Troubadour in LA? Was that during the time you covered, or?
Yeah. He starts at the Troubadour in October of '65, playing with Nina Simone, I believe. And he continues. That's the interesting thing about his early, those years in LA, is that Pryor did not choose to live in black parts of LA. He could have lived in Baldwin Hills. He preferred to live near the Sunset Strip, or Beverly Hills, or Laurel Canyon, kind of a crucible of the counterculture. So when he was playing the Troubadour, he's really in this kind of he's like the one black comic in a very white world. And he's, kind of soaking in the atmosphere of that counterculture. As the 60s go on, and as, Black Power movement kind of takes more of center stage, he'll start to get more involved with black radicals in LA. But he begins kind of with us centered around that Troubadour crowd.
I saw him there.
Oh, you did? Hey. That's great. How was he?
He was great. He did that bit with the judge. My client is not a drug dealer per se. When he was caught with the 200 kilos of cocaine, he was trying to build a hospital. And then he did the child molester bit. It was white guy. How dare you? I am not. And meanwhile,
Oh, he's like doing the lineup. Like he was doing like a lineup? Is that okay? Is he doing a
yeah,
lineup?
and he does the thing where he puts his hand in his pants while he's denying he's a child molester. I would never, how dare you, and and it could have been the 60s for all I remember.
Yeah, that sounds like 69 or so. The amazing thing to me in doing all these interviews is that, Richard Pryor was probably one of the most intensely memorable people that ever existed in the world. Because the things he said were so razor sharp that they kind of stuck in people's minds. The things he did were so razor sharp that they stuck in the mind. So, I often will meet people and they're like, yeah, I remember he did this routine. People really, how often does that happen? So I feel very fortunate to have been his biographer. So memorable. Yeah.
I just want to thank you for framing him as a cultural trickster, and way more than just a comedian that set himself on fire, and justly put him in that historical framework. Because it took your degree of scholarship to be able to achieve that, dogged drudgery, or whatever you call it, and I think it paid off hugely.
Well, thank you. And I should say too, I don't know how many people know, so I also built a website that's a digital companion to the book at becomingrichardpryor.com. And it's like, basically it's about that Peoria world that he came from. It's called, the site actually called Richard Pryor's Peoria, but I put up about 200 of the primary documents that I used to write the first part of the book, first 100 pages. It's all curated, and it's multimedia. There's a little movie. I built it with a team of students and researchers. So that's there for you. That I really wanted to say, because when I started this book, people were like, did he really grow up in a brothel, or is he just saying that, It's like, no, he really did. But it's more complicated. He didn't just grow up in a brothel. He grew up in a brothel in the 40s. Peoria was a sin city in 1940, but by 1950 it wanted to clean up its act. So they put in a freeway and a bridge right where Richard Pryor was living with his grandmother and his family. That area is demolished, urban renewal, right? This is historical forces. And Richard Pryor moves with his grandmother to a very white part of town. The red light district was one of the most interracial parts of Peoria. It was a place of freedom as well as violence. And that's when he's about 12, 13 years old, He's in a very white part of town suddenly. He's going to all white schools where he's the only black person. That's the beginning of his life as a crossover comedian. He's in 6th, 7th, and 8th grades performing for white audiences in his classrooms, and in recess he'll get beaten up by the white boys, and they'll call him the N-word. And then he has his 10 minutes on Friday afternoon to perform for that class. And they like him, they laugh at him when he's a comedian, but they beat him up and call him these epithets. So it's a recipe for a kind of lifelong ambivalence. But this is kind of a historical story. It's because there's these larger historical forces that are moving his family out of that red light district, closing down the red light district, and so on. And so that's the thing that the website will hope to.
On Mark.
Yeah, please.
I saw him perform in '63 in Manhattan.
Oh my goodness, you're like you're the earliest person I've ever.
Hey, when you're old, you get to see everything.
That's
And
great.
it tells a
Was
story.
it the living room, or what? Would you
I
remember
don't
the club?
remember, it was a small nightclub on the East Side.
Yeah.
And he tells a story about when he was a teenager and how he got beaten up. And he said he was living in a Jewish tenement house
Yeah.
that was mostly inhabited by Hispanics.
Right.
And he'd go to school and he'd say, let's get him, he's all of them.
Yeah.
And he got
But-
beat up for being all of the
Yeah.
minorities of town.
It's great you remember that. But I would say that version of his life was utter fabrication. There were no tenement buildings in Peoria. And I talked about how he comes to New York and he almost has to reinvent himself as a New Yorker. So this idea of there being the New York multi-ethnic neighborhood, that's like he's confecting a past for himself. He's not able to speak about what it really was like growing up in Peoria. But it's great you remember that. And that is one of his first jokes.
He made
I'm
great
very
sound.
impressed, man. That's a great memory.
He made great sounds too. He could like trucks moving and stuff like that. And I think he used to do some of that occasionally.
Yeah, no,
Very funny.
one person, one person I met who helped write with him the movie Which Way Is Up, Carl Gottlieb, great writer, and he talked about how Richard Pryor would just start performing The Wizard of Oz. It's one of his favorite movies. And do all the little the Munchkin City, this and all the little Munchkin voices, all the voices. And he said, Richard Pryor, if he wanted to, could have been the greatest mimic ever. He would have been so much, as good as Rich Little and so on. But he had that. He had so many different elements of the comedian's craft down. But he was going for the bigger game.
Wasn't there a documentary recently on HBO or something just like
There's been two actually. There was a Showtime did a documentary called Omit the Logic, and PBS did an Icon, Richard Pryor Icon.
That one? Did you have anything to do with that?
I was part of Omit the Logic. I was interviewed for Omit the Logic. Yeah. But we're in a moment of Richard Pryor revival, I think, which is he remains terribly relevant, given the problems that still afflict our society.
One more, Matt, did you have one?
Yeah, I was just wondering, how did Richard Pryor become your project? And what got you involved with
That's a
Richard
great
Pryor?
question. There's the short answer and the long answer.
Right.
The short answer is one that I hinted at before. Basically, I was based in Berkeley, and so I wanted to figure out what happened to him when he was in Berkeley. And so that was a great pilot project for the whole of the biography, to start with the Berkeley enigma.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that basically wherever I went in his life, there's so much more that hadn't been said. And that's what a writer or a researcher or biographer is looking for. Is like new archival materials, a new way of telling the story and giving it those other dimensions. That's why I started it when I was 37. I feel, I look back at my life and like, well, I was introduced to Richard Pryor when I was 9 years old or something, and I saw him in Silver Streak with Gene Wilder. And I was growing up in the San Fernando Valley, a very Anglo part of LA. I was a very bookish nerd, still am. And Gene Wilder was playing a book editor. I identify with the Gene Wilder character. And in that movie, Gene Wilder needs the Richard Pryor character to survive in the world. Gene Wilder, the Richard Pryor character, they have that pairing, and Richard Pryor kind of cuts a hole towards the new reality that is the larger world. And so I think in some ways, like the seeds of this project were like me watching Silver Streak or Stork Race, and I'm like, my little suburban world is not the world. It can't be. And I think like for many people, Richard Pryor became somebody who led me to larger discoveries about the complexity of the world I live in, the pain there, the grace of it, and so on.
Thank you, Scott.
It's my pleasure.